My name is Pat McCormick, and I work at the Springfield-Greene County Library as an assistant manager to the gift shop manager. I would like to welcome you to my travelogue. Last summer, in June of 2020, just as we all started venturing outside again, my husband and I decided to plan a trip out west to visit some of the national parks. I started calling around, and because of all the cancellations due to COVID, found that we could actually secure lodging within some of the parks. This just a month before our planned departure. In normal times, that would be unheard of. So I mapped out an ambitious schedule and route. Our tour began to the north in the Badlands of North Dakota, then westward to Wyoming for Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons, south to Utah for Zion, Bryce, and Arches, and finally east to Colorado to Mesa Verde. Though we were 14 straight days of visiting national parks, our overall itinerary was 19 days. 3 to reach the Badlands, which was because we stopped in Nebraska for a couple of nights, then 2 to get home from Mesa Verde. We traveled 4,000 miles in that time and never spent more than 2 nights in the same place, and half the time it was one and out. Needless to say, by the end, we were ready to head home. As rushed as it was, we took in an incredible amount of sightseeing and hiking. The drive was beautiful everywhere, and we were lucky with the weather. It only rained a few times. Let me start with the Badlands. The Badlands got its name from the Lakota people who called it Makosika, which literally translates to the Badlands. It is an incredible, otherworldly landscape covering over 240,000 acres. Entering from the east, you immediately encounter the door and window areas. Here you see sculpted spires and layered rock formations. As you follow the Badlands Loop Road, there are multiple overlooks, some of which have trailheads for hikes. As you move from east to west, the park begins to change from hard rock formations to a mix of rock and grassland. And it is here that you will have the opportunity to spy buffalo, bighorn sheep, and prairie dogs. Here you can see in the upper left-hand corner a buffalo resting. To the right, you see 2 longhorn sheep. And in the bottom photo, those arrows are pointing to prairie dogs. The Badlands contain one of the world's largest fossil beds. We spent 1 day here, but if you want to take in hiking, I would definitely recommend 2 days minimum. We stayed in Wall that night and set out for Mount Rushmore the next morning. Mount Rushmore is about a 1-hour drive from Wall and on the way westward. It is worth stopping for. Set in the beautiful Black Hills of South Dakota, you enter the monument through the Avenue of Flags with all 50 states represented and behold the sight of the 4 presidents looking out across our great land. The small photograph in the lower left-hand corner is the original model for Mount Rushmore. Not far from there is the Crazy Horse Memorial. While not nearly as defined as Mount Rushmore, it nonetheless has its own emerging strength. Sculptor Korczak Zielkowski began the project in the 40s, and it continues through private funding and the dedication of the management and staff today. From the Black Hills, we drove west towards Wyoming. We had one more stop before Yellowstone. Nature's magnificent sculpture Devil's Tower. Known to those who remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it is a geological feature that protrudes out of the prairie surrounding the Black Hills. It rises over 1,200 feet above the ground and almost 900 feet from the summit to the base. There is a paved trail around the base, which is just over a mile. After spending the night in Moreland, Wyoming, we headed to Yellowstone the next morning. It was a beautiful drive. Yellowstone National Park is nearly 3,500 square miles, or just over 2 million acres of wilderness on top of a volcanic hotspot, and is the world's first national park. Mostly in Wyoming, the park spreads into parts of Montana and Idaho too. Yellowstone features dramatic canyons, rapid rivers, lush forests, hot springs, and gushing geysers, including its most famous, Old Faithful. It is also home to hundreds of animal species, including bears, wolves, bison, elk, and antelope. We entered through the east gate with no wait and were greeted by snow-capped mountains. As we wound down into the valley, the Lake Yellowstone to our with Lake Yellowstone to our left and fields full of wildflowers to our right, we spotted a couple of buffalo grazing. Further along the road, as we passed the turnoff for Lake Village and Fishing Bridge, we saw a family of elk grazing and lounging in the grass. You were alerted to these sideshows by seeing a number of cars pulled off the road to one side or the other. We were heading to our cabin at Old Faithful, but made a few stops along the way at the various outlooks, mostly along Lake Yellowstone. Once past the lake, we stopped at Kepler Cascade, which is a waterfall on the Firehole River. It drops approximately 150 feet over multiple steps. The longest drop is 50 feet. The next morning, our first stop was Old Faithful. Old Faithful can vary in height from 100 to 180 feet, with an average near 130. Eruptions normally last between 2 to 5 minutes. It currently erupts around 20 times a day, or about every 75 minutes. We saw it erupt 3 different times, and each time was a bit different. Old Faithful is located in the Upper Geyser Basin, which also boasts the largest concentration of geysers in the world, including many of the world's largest. Hot springs are closely related to geysers, but they are open pools of water. Some hot springs have bright bands of orange, yellow, and green ringing the deep blue waters in the spring. The multicolored layers get their hues from different species of heat-loving bacteria living in the progressively cooler water around the spring. The hotter water of the center prevents most bacterial growth, resulting in the exceptionally clear blue water. We headed from the upper geyser to the lower geyser and hiked back to Firehole Falls, and at 220 feet high, it's Yellowstone's tallest front country waterfall. It is about 1.5 miles back to the falls from the basin. Off the trailhead to your right, you can see clouds of orange and blue emanating from the ground. This is the Grand Prismatic Spring, which is the most photographed thermal feature in Yellowstone. That is because of its crazy bright colors and enormous size. It is the largest in the country and the 3rd largest in the world. And at 370 feet in diameter, it is larger than a football field. From the trail, there is a short hike up to an overlook, which is well worth the effort. The following day, we headed to another area of the basin, Biscuit Basin, where we saw more of the same beautiful hot springs and smaller geysers. The deep blue spring in the upper corner is called Sapphire Pool. But our true intention was to hike to Mystic Falls, and this is where you find the trailhead. This trail follows a lovely creek through a mixed conifer forest to the 70-foot Mystic Falls, over which the Little Firehole River drops from the Madison Plateau. This was, in our opinion, a much more worthwhile hike, less than 3 miles round trip than the one to Fairy Falls. The wildflowers are all over Yellowstone, but this hike was particularly enchanting due to the variety of colors and textures of the foliage. We left the Old Faithful area and headed to Canyon Village, where we planned to camp for the night, which, by the way, we will never camp for one night again. Along the way, we stopped at Firehole Falls. Those are the falls on the left, which are located approximately a half-mile upstream from the confluence of the Firehole and Gibbons River at Madison Junction. It has a drop of approximately 40 feet. Further up the road, about 4 miles up the Gibbons River, we reached Gibbons Falls, which has a drop of approximately 84 feet. Before setting up camp, we had time to explore a bit more and headed to the brink of the lower falls of the Yellowstone River. As the Yellowstone River flows north from Yellowstone Lake, it leaves the Hayden Valley and plunges first over the upper falls, then a quarter-mile downstream over the lower falls, at which point it then enters the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, which is up to 1,000 feet deep. The lower Yellowstone Falls is the largest volume waterfall in the Rocky Mountains of the United States. These falls are 308 feet high, or nearly twice as high as Niagara Falls. The shot on the left is taken from Inspiration Point, where you can just make out the falls in the distance, and is about 2 to 3 miles downriver from the falls. It got very cold that night, down to 34 degrees. The next morning, we repacked all the camping equipment and headed to the upper falls, which are 109 feet high. The middle shot, taken from Uncle Tom's Point, is said to be the most photographed view in the park. We left the Canyon Village area and headed south, passing through Hayden Valley. The road follows the Yellowstone River from the falls and canyon on its journey to Yellowstone Lake. The valley is well known as one of the best locations to view wildlife in Yellowstone. And yes, that is a buffalo at the base of that photograph. We also saw elk grazing out in the fields and, of course, lots of birds. One of the overlooks to the river boasted a trout viewing area, so while I could not catch it on film, I did see trout flying. There is also a shot of Lake Yellowstone here, looking towards Absaroka Range, as well as a lone elk that we saw grazing along the way. We passed through Lake Village and West Thumb, both on the lake, onto a much smaller lake where we stopped to picnic. Lewis Lake was a lovely spot, where just a bit further on, we stopped to photograph the cascading Lewis Falls on the Lewis River, a moderate height of 30 feet. On our final stop, we saw Moose Falls, which is also a 30-foot fall, but of the plunge variety. Heading south from Yellowstone, we passed through the John D. Rockefeller Memorial Parkway, which was established in 1972 and encompasses 24,000 acres and connects Grand Teton National Park with Yellowstone. The Grand Tetons cover approximately 300,000 acres or 485 square miles. You may notice the trees in the background show fire damage. This is a sight not uncommon throughout the West. The first stop was the Jackson Lake Overlook, which you get your first glimpse of Mount Moran at 12,600 feet and just beyond the peaks of the Grand Tetons. We headed to our cabin in Coulter Bay Village and settled in for our 2-night stay. Our first hike of the day was Hermitage Point Trail from Coulter Bay Village to Heron Pond, during which we saw a mother bear and her 3 cubs. I only got a picture of the last cub. The views of Jackson Lake and Mount Moran were breathtaking, as were the wildflowers. From there, we drove south on the Teton Park Road, and our next stop, Signal Mountain, elevation 7,700 feet. We saw elk on the way up the mountain, and then happened upon an artist painting Mount Moran. Our next stop was Jenny Lake Visitor Center. It is from here that we saw our first direct views of the Grand Tetons. Grand Teton at 13,770 feet, Middle Teton at 12,804 feet, and South Teton at 12,514 feet. Our final adventure of the day was an evening float trip down the Snake River. We loaded into vans, of course all wearing masks, at Moose Junction, which is the Southern Park exit. We loaded into the rafts about 8 miles upriver and floated back to the Moose Point. It was about a 3-hour trip, during which we spotted at least 5 different bald eagles and 2 nests with babies, beaver, and finally a moose. It was a female, so no rack. It was a wonderful experience, with much of it owing to our very capable and friendly guide, Bernie. The next morning, we packed up and headed south once again on the Teton Park Road. We made a few more stops on our way out, one of which was an attempt to find the spot where Ansel Adams took his famous shot of the Tetons and Snake River, which I have included here in the upper right-hand corner. We were told the spot was along a trail at Schwambacher Landing. After hiking all the way to the Snake River, I was never able to find the exact spot, but I did manage to capture an image close to his, with the Snake River flowing below the majestic peaks of the Tetons. A side note, the trees have grown quite a bit taller since 1942. The shot of the cabin is from the Mormon Row Historic District. Can you imagine waking up to that every day? We drove through Jackson Hole and stopped at the National Museum of Wildlife Art, and from there drove just south to Salt Lake City and spent the night. The next day, we finished the drive to arrive at Springdale, a small but delightful town, which is located at the entrance to Zion, Utah's first national park. We stayed in town that evening and began our Zion adventure the next morning. It was not until we arrived in Springdale that we were told they were not allowing private vehicles into the park unless you had reservations to stay in the park. Luckily for us, we were staying that night in a cabin at Zion Lodge, so we were able to drive to the lodge and park. They have a shuttle bus, but again, due to COVID, you must make reservations online in advance, which we were not able to do. So our adventures within Zion only included how far our feet could take us. This meant, at least for us, that we did not venture further into the canyon beyond the grotto. It did not stop us from enjoying the sights we could see. The first notable structure is called the Court of the Patriarchs, which you spot as you drive to the lodge. The other shot is just one of the many walls of the canyon. Our first hike was on the Emerald Pools Trail. These images capture the texture of the walls along the trail. The trailhead near the lodge only allowed a partial ascent due to some trail repairs, so to actually reach the pools, we had to pick up a trail further up the road at the grotto. As you begin to hike up, the views open in all directions. The Virgin River runs through the canyon and is seen here in the upper right-hand corner. Finally, we were rewarded by reaching the pools. There are 3 levels, and the views are spectacular. The middle pool trickles down to the lower pool, and the upper is much further up from the middle, and the water source is at times underground. The top pool is in an area called Heaps Canyon, which at certain times of the year, or after a large rainfall, have large waterfalls. The shot on the right is a portion of the canyon. The other is looking towards Zion Canyon. We spent a lovely evening in our cabin and packed up the next morning to take in the Watchmen Trail, which is near the visitor center. Again, the views were breathtaking, and so was the hike, with a lot of heavy breathing. This shows the canyon we climbed into on the left, and the view from the lookout once we reached the end of the trail. The trails themselves are marvels, and all of the work that went into their development is appreciated. The retaining wall on this trail is a great example. When you exit the visitor center and head east on the Zion Mountain Carmel Highway, you are treated to new variations in the terrain. This portion of the park is open to private vehicle use, and there are a few turnoffs and overlooks to take in the landscape, as well as a 1-mile tunnel, which was built back in the 1920s and requires special passes for RVs with limited times to pass through. One of the most notable features of this area is the Checkerboard Mesa at almost 6,700 feet in elevation. That's the slide to the picture to the left. It is not much further past this that you exit the park. We were on our way to Bryce. We had a beautiful drive from there to our accommodations outside Bryce Canyon in a little town called Cannonville, right on the edge of the Grand Staircase Escalade National Monument. We decided to take the shuttle bus into the park, thinking that would work better for us, but I will say Bryce, unlike Zion, allowed private cars, which allows you greater flexibility and would be my recommendation. First stop was Inspiration Point, and as you can see, it was inspirational. Hoodoos, which are irregular columns of rock, exist on every continent, but here is the largest concentration found anywhere on Earth. Situated a high plateau at the top of the Grand Staircase. The park's high elevations include numerous life communities and geological wonders that defy description. From there, we headed to Sunset Point to pick up the Navajo Loop Trail with a detour to go through Wall Street, which is a very steep 550 feet drop in elevation. At the bottom, you walk through a narrow passage and continue hiking through to the next junction. We then followed that around to the Queen's Garden Trail and visited with Queen Victoria. Notice the striking resemblance in the photo to the left and then again in the right. The trail meanders through the hoodoos and other geological structures of the area, where again I was amazed at the work that went into building these trails. Notice the retaining wall in that narrow passage in the photo on the left. As we came closer to the top and closer to Sunrise Point and the end of our 3.5-mile hike, the vista to the north from that area provided a very different landscape as seen in the right-hand slide. But looking back from where we came, a summer shower developed, which we were glad to have escaped. We retrieved our car and headed to the interior and southern end of the park to get a better overview of the 36,000-acre park. One of the highlights of the park is Natural Bridge, which has a very accessible view from a roadside pull-off. The final stop we made was to Rainbow Point, which at 9,100 feet is the highest point in the park. I know I keep saying this, but the drive from Bryce to Arches was beautiful, and at times a little scary because of the threat of weather, but the rain traveled around us, and we arrived at Moab later that evening. Arches National Park contains the world's largest concentration of natural sandstone arches. Although over 2,000 arches are located within the park's 76,000 acres, the park also contains an astonishing variety of other geological formations. Almost immediately upon entering the park is the Courthouse Towers area. The three gossips and sheep rock are shown in the photo to the left. The organ is in the center. And on the right, and further down the road from here, is Balanced Rock. One of the things that struck me the most was the variation in color. Red sandstones in the park contain iron oxide. Greenish rocks also contain iron, but in a reduced state. Depending on the conditions under which a rock was formed, iron can color rocks red, black, orange, purple, or greenish gray. And you saw all of those hues here in Arches. The hike of the day was to Delicate Arch, which was a 3-mile round trip, fairly challenging hike. No shade was available, and there was an elevation gain of almost 500 feet. It was well worth the effort. Delicate Arch is a 52-foot high freestanding arch. It is depicted on the Utah license plate and is the most widely recognized landmark in the park. The arch stands on the brink of a canyon with the dramatic La Salle Mountains as a backdrop. As I stated earlier, there are over 2,000 arches in Arches National Park, and many are visible from the roadway. For instance, Skyline Arch, which is the upper left-hand corner. Then on the right, Tunnel Arch is in the Devil's Garden area and is only viewable from the trail. Pine Tree Arch is also in the Devil's Garden along the trail. The landscape throughout the park has undulating bands of color ranging from red, green, gold, and black, as I spoke of before. The lower right-hand photo is of Balanced Rock, there in the center, in situ. Again from the road, we were able to see this collection of arches, all located in the windows section. You see Double Arch, which is the upper right-hand corner, North Window, which is the upper left-hand corner, and the Parade of Elephants, which is the bottom left. The right-hand bottom is an extended view of the Elephant Butte. We hit the road in the late afternoon and headed to our final destination, Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado. Today, with over 52,000 acres, Mesa Verde National Park preserves and protects nearly 5,000 archaeological sites, which includes 600 cliff dwellings and over 3 million associated objects in the park's research collection. I must say, this is where COVID and the weather had the biggest impact. While we could access overlooks to view the dwellings, we could not actually tour them, which in normal times is the highlight of visiting the park. This sculpture resides outside the visitor center near the entrance. From there, we took the Chapman Mesa Road to explore the area. Our first stop was the Montezuma Valley Overlook, and then to Park Point Overlook with the 86,000-foot elevation and the highest, which is the highest in the park. Cliff Palace is the largest cliff dwelling in North America and is located in the southeast end of the park in Cliff Canyon. As you look out into the canyon, you see remnants of other dwellings. Also on Cliff Palace Loop is the balcony house, shown in the lower left, but it is in Soda Canyon, which is the shot on the right. We're here too, along the opposite cliffs of the canyon. You spot small cavities here and there with signs of habitation. Hemingway House is shown in the upper left-hand corner and is at the southeastern end of the Soda Canyon. Our final stop was the Chapman Mesa Archeological Museum area, where Spruce Tree House is located. We hiked part of the Spruce Canyon Trail and enjoyed the views. Point Lookout, which is shown on the right, is an 8,400-foot elevation sandstone summit located near the entrance and is, to say the least, a very distinctive feature of the park. The final shot was taken as we were leaving the park from Mancos Valley Overlook, facing the east. We were ready to head to the Rockies and homeward from there. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have enjoyed our adventure.